The morning had started so peacefully. The mountain air was crisp, the birds were singing their familiar tunes, and Grandpa and I were enjoying our coffee on the wooden porch of his beloved mountain lodge. The view was breathtaking. Rolling green hills stretched as far as the eye could see, with a magnificent backdrop of snow-capped mountains. Where are you watching this video from right now? Drop a comment below and let me know which state or country you're in, because I promise, this story will make you want to pack your bags and come witness this showdown firsthand. Trust me, what happened next was something straight out of a movie, except it was happening right before my eyes. It was the kind of scene that makes you want to grab popcorn and settle in for the show. Our serene morning was abruptly interrupted by the sound of tires crunching on the gravel driveway. A sleek black SUV pulled up, and out stepped a woman with perfect blonde hair styled in the quintessential "Can I speak to your manager, Bob?" She wore designer sunglasses perched on her nose and clutched a thick folder of papers against her chest, like it contained state secrets. Her high heels clicked purposefully as she marched toward us, her face set in a determined frown. I immediately sensed trouble. My grandfather, however, seemed unfazed, continuing to sip his coffee as if nothing unusual was happening. "Good morning," the woman announced, her voice carrying an authoritative tone that suggested she was used to being obeyed. "I'm Victoria Harrington, Vice President of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association." She thrust a business card toward Grandpa, who made no move to take it. After an awkward moment, she placed it on the table between us. "I'm here to discuss some urgent matters regarding your property's compliance with our community standards." There was a practiced sweetness to her voice that did nothing to mask the underlying threat. Grandpa finally looked up, his weathered face revealing nothing of his thoughts. "I wasn't aware that this property fell under any HOA jurisdiction," he said mildly, taking another sip of his coffee. "This lodge has been in my family for over 40 years, long before any association was established in this area." His voice was calm, but I knew him well enough to detect the slight edge beneath his words. Victoria, or Karen as I would come to think of her, pursed her lips in obvious displeasure at his response. "Well, Mr. Reynolds, I have documentation here that says otherwise," she replied, opening her folder with a flourish. She pulled out a stack of papers and began rattling off a list of alleged violations. "Your exterior paint doesn't match our approved color palette. Your fence exceeds our height restrictions by 3 inches. The native plants in your garden aren't on our approved vegetation list. And according to our records, you haven't paid any association dues for the past 5 years. She paused for dramatic effect, clearly expecting Grandpa to be intimidated by this litany of infractions. "I'm afraid these violations could result in severe penalties, possibly even forfeiture of property if not addressed immediately." Grandpa's expression remained unchanged as he listened to her accusations. When she finished, he simply said, "I'd like to see the documentation that shows my property is subject to your association's rules." His voice was steady, but there was something in his tone, a confidence that seemed to momentarily throw Victoria off balance. She shuffled through her papers and produced what looked like a boundary map of the area, with various properties highlighted in different colors. "As you can see, your property falls within the red boundary, which is clearly within HOA jurisdiction," she stated, pointing to a spot on the map. Grandpa took the map, studied it for a moment, then handed it back to her. "I'm afraid I can't sign anything today. I'll need time to review these claims with my own documentation," he said, politely but firmly. Victoria's face flushed with irritation. "Mr. Reynolds, this isn't a negotiation. The HOA has legal authority here, and we expect compliance. Our legal team will be in touch if you refuse to cooperate." She gathered her papers with sharp, angry movements. As she turned to leave, she stabbed a warning finger in Grandpa's direction. "I'll be back, Mr. Reynolds, and next time I won't be alone. The law will be on my side." With that parting shot, she strode back to her SUV, her heels digging into the gravel with each forceful step. Grandpa watched her go, his face still a mask of calm. When the sound of her engine had faded, he reached for the citation notice she had pinned to our door on her way out. He looked at it for a long moment, then a small smile played at the corners of his mouth. "They don't know who they're dealing with yet," he said softly, and in that moment, I saw a gleam in his eye that I hadn't seen in years. After Victoria's dramatic exit, Grandpa and I retreated inside the lodge. The interior was just as I remembered from my childhood visits, warm, rustic, with a comforting smell of pine and old books. Massive wooden beams crossed the ceiling, and a stone fireplace dominated one wall. Years of family photos lined the mantelpiece, capturing happy memories of fishing trips, holiday gatherings, and quiet evenings spent watching the sunset from the porch. This place wasn't just a building, it was a repository of family history, a sanctuary that had sheltered generations of Reynolds through both celebrations and hardships. "You know, I bought this place right after winning my first major case," Grandpa said, settling into his favorite armchair by the window. His gaze drifted to the framed law degree hanging on the wall, Harvard Law, class of 1975. Next to it hung numerous awards and recognitions from his illustrious career. Back then, there was nothing out here but wilderness, no fancy neighborhoods, no HOAs, just peace and quiet. His voice carried a nostalgic warmth as he recounted how he had fallen in love with the property on first sight. For decades, he had balanced his high-pressure career as a partner at Reynolds, Mitchell & Clark, one of the nation's most prestigious real estate law firms, with weekends and holidays spent at this mountain retreat. When he finally retired 5 years ago, the lodge became his permanent home, a well-earned haven after years of legal battles and courtroom victories. "I don't understand how they can suddenly claim jurisdiction over your property," I said, puzzling over Victoria's visit. "Is that even legally possible?" Grandpa's response was interrupted by a knock at the door. This time it was Tom Wilson, one of the few neighbors Grandpa had befriended since moving here full-time. Tom's expression was apologetic as he handed over an envelope. "Sorry to bother you, James, but I was asked to deliver this. Emergency HOA meeting tomorrow morning. They're discussing your unauthorized residency, whatever that means." He lowered his voice. "Between you and me, something fishy's going on. Karen of Victoria and her crew have been pushing hard to get control of properties on this ridge. Word is, they're planning to develop the area into some kind of luxury resort. They've already forced out the Johnsons and the Garcias by flooding them with violation notices and fines until they couldn't take it anymore." Grandpa thanked Tom for the warning and the information. After he left, we spent the afternoon piecing together what was happening. Through calls to other neighbors and some online research, we discovered that Victoria Harrington had been systematically expanding the HOA's territory through dubious legal maneuvers. She would identify properties she wanted, find or fabricate some technical violation of HOA rules, then leverage the association's resources to harass the owners into submission. Most people didn't have the time, money, or energy to fight back against the barrage of legal threats and financial penalties. Selling their homes at below-market prices to HOA-approved buyers, often Victoria's business partners, seemed like the only way out. "This isn't just about enforcing community standards," Grandpa said grimly, reviewing the pattern of acquisitions on a local map. "This is nothing short of legalized property theft." He pointed to a recent real estate listing that showed a former neighbor's home purchased under duress for $200,000. Now on the market for nearly double that amount. The listing boasted about the property's exclusive location and upcoming luxury amenities, clear evidence of the development plans Tom had mentioned. Victoria's strategy was as simple as it was unethical. Force people out, acquire their properties cheaply, then resell at a massive profit once the development plans were announced publicly. I looked at Grandpa, concern etching my features. "So what do we do? Should we call a lawyer?" The question hung in the air between us, and I realized how ridiculous it sounded the moment it left my lips. Grandpa, after all, wasn't just any retiree. He was James Reynolds, the attorney who had once successfully argued before the Supreme Court in a landmark property rights case. A man whose legal textbooks were still studied in law schools across the country. He smiled at my question, a familiar glint of strategic calculation in his eyes. "No, we don't need to call a lawyer," he replied, his voice taking on the measured cadence I remembered from his courtroom days. Let's wait for them to make their move first, then we'll respond accordingly." There was something in his tone, a quiet confidence bordering on anticipation, that made me realize Victoria Harrington had just picked a fight with exactly the wrong person. The next morning, we arrived at the Pine Valley Community Center for the emergency HOA meeting. The room was already packed with residents, many of whom gave Grandpa curious or sympathetic glances as we found seats near the back. At the front, a long table was set up with name placards. Victoria sat at the center, flanked by the HOA president, a nervous-looking man named Robert Johnson who seemed more figurehead than leader, and several board members whose expressions suggested they were firmly in Victoria's camp. The room quieted as Robert called the meeting to order, but it was Victoria who immediately took control, standing up with an air of authority that bordered on theatrical. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," she began, her voice projecting to the back of the room. "We have a serious situation that threatens the integrity and property values of our community." She gestured dramatically toward Grandpa. "Mr. James Reynolds has been operating a non-compliant property on Evergreen Ridge. Despite multiple notices, he has refused to bring his residents up to community standards or acknowledge HOA." She then launched into a meticulously prepared presentation, complete with photos of Grandpa's lodge and highlighted sections of the HOA bylaws. According to Victoria, Grandpa had committed numerous violations, constructing unapproved outbuildings, his tool shed, improper waste disposal, a compost pile for his garden, threatening behavior toward HOA representatives, apparently giving Victoria a skeptical look qualified as threatening, and, most seriously, refusing to sign the updated HOA agreement that had supposedly incorporated his property 5 years ago. Throughout this performance, Grandpa sat quietly, taking notes on a small pad. When Victoria finally concluded her litany of accusations, Robert hesitantly asked if anyone wanted to respond. Grandpa stood up, and I noticed several board members exchange smirks, clearly expecting an elderly man out of his depth. How wrong they were. "Thank you for the opportunity to address these claims," Grandpa began, his voice clear and measured. Without referring to his notes, he systematically dismantled Victoria's arguments one by one. He cited specific property law statutes that protected grandfathered properties from retroactive HOA inclusion. He referenced federal and state regulations that superseded HOA rules regarding environmental practices like composting. Most devastatingly, he questioned the legal standing of the HOA to enforce rules on a property that had never voluntarily joined the association. "Ms. Harrington, you've presented what appears to be a boundary map showing my property within HOA jurisdiction," Grandpa said, his tone respectful but firm. "However, I notice this map is dated 3 years ago. My property deed and the original township survey, which I have here," he held up a folder of documents, "clearly show that my land was established as a separate parcel decades before the HOA's formation. Under the Pine County Property Statutes, Section 47.3, a pre-existing property cannot be incorporated into an HOA without the owner's explicit written consent." Victoria's face had gradually transitioned from confident to concern as Grandpa spoke. Now she attempted to regain control of the narrative. "We have your signature on the incorporation agreement, Mr. Reynolds," she stated, producing a document from her folder with a flourish. Grandpa asked to see it, and after examining it briefly, he looked up with a hint of amusement. "This signature bears little resemblance to mine, and the date on this document indicates I supposedly signed it while I was in Boston for my grandson's graduation. I have boarding passes and hotel receipts to confirm my whereabouts on that date." The room erupted in murmurs. Victoria's face flushed red as she realized the implications of what Grandpa was suggesting. Document forgery was a serious offense. Robert, looking increasingly uncomfortable, hastily suggested tabling the discussion until the board could review all documentation thoroughly. Victoria attempted to object, but she was clearly thrown off balance by the unexpected challenge to her authority. As the meeting broke up, I noticed several residents approaching Grandpa, sharing their own stories of intimidation by Victoria and the HOA board. Meanwhile, Victoria huddled with her allies in a corner. their expressions dark as they cast occasional glances our way. As we walked back to the car, Victoria suddenly appeared, blocking our path. Her earlier poise had been replaced by barely contained fury. "This isn't over, Mr. Reynolds," she hissed, keeping her voice low enough that only we could hear. "I will find proof that your property is subject to HOA rules, and when I do, you'll regret this little performance." Grandpa regarded her calmly. "Feel free to look for that proof, Miss Harrington," he replied. "In the meantime, I suggest you review Pine County's statutes on document falsification. The penalties can be quite severe." Victoria's expression hardened, but I caught a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes before she turned and stalked away. As we drove home, Grandpa seemed lost in thought. "She won't give up easily," he finally said. "People like Victoria don't respond well to being challenged publicly. If anything, we've just made her more determined." I worried about what that might mean, but Grandpa seemed almost pleased by the prospect. As we pulled into the driveway of the lodge, he added, "The real show is just beginning." The next few days brought an unsettling quiet. Too quiet, according to Grandpa, who knew from decades of legal battles that silence often preceded the most aggressive moves. We used the lull to prepare, with Grandpa diving into boxes of old documents stored in the lodge's attic. Meanwhile, I made a trip to the county records office to obtain certified copies of property maps and deeds. It was there that I met Sarah Donovan, a records clerk with an encyclopedic knowledge of local property law and a friendly smile that brightened when I mentioned my grandfather's name. "James Reynolds? The James Reynolds from Reynolds, Mitchell & Clark?" she asked, clearly impressed. When I confirmed that yes, my grandfather was that James Reynolds, her assistants became even more enthusiastic. "Your grandfather's Westfield v. Suburban Developments case was required reading when I was studying for my paralegal certification," she explained as she helped me navigate the county's Byzantine filing system. "He basically rewrote the book on property easement rights. I'd be happy to help you find whatever you need." With Sarah's help, we discovered that not only was Grandpa's property definitely outside the original HOA boundaries, but several other properties that Victoria claimed for the HOA were similarly exempt. "This map shows the official boundaries as registered with the county," Sarah explained, pointing to a clearly marked line that fell well short of Grandpa's lodge. "And here's the only amendment filed since then. Notice it doesn't include the ridge area either." She lowered her voice. "Between you and me, there have been some irregularities with recent HOA filings. Nothing I could officially flag, but documents appearing with backdated timestamps, boundary descriptions that don't match previous records. If I didn't know better, I'd think someone was trying to rewrite property history." I thanked Sarah for her insights and her contact information, suspecting we might need her expertise again before this was over. When I returned to the lodge, I found the driveway blocked by a group of people gathered around Victoria, who was holding what appeared to be an impromptu press conference for the local community newsletter. "This area has so much potential," she was saying to a man with a camera, "but unfortunately, certain residents are resistant to progress and community standards. Mr. Reynolds' property, for instance, poses environmental and safety hazards that affect everyone in Pine Valley." She gestured dramatically toward the lodge. "Unregulated septic systems, non-compliant electrical work, possible watershed contamination. These are serious concerns that the HOA has a responsibility to address." I stood frozen, listening to her spread these baseless accusations to anyone who would listen. She was clearly trying to turn public opinion against Grandpa before any legal proceedings began, a classic pressure tactic. When Victoria noticed me, she flashed a triumphant smile but continued her performance without missing a beat. Inside, I found Grandpa at his desk, surrounded by legal texts and documents. He wasn't surprised when I told him about Victoria's impromptu media event. "It's a predictable move," he said, pushing his reading glasses up on his nose. "She's trying to create a narrative that justifies her actions. If enough people believe her story about safety hazards and environmental concerns, she gains public support for whatever she does next." What worried me more was what Grandpa revealed next. He'd received a notice from the county building inspector's office about an anonymous complaint regarding code violations at the lodge. "They've scheduled an inspection for next week," he said, showing me the official letter. Apparently, someone reported dangerous structural issues that pose an imminent threat to occupants and neighbors. The timing was too perfect to be coincidental. Victoria was escalating her campaign on multiple fronts. While Grandpa seemed remarkably calm about these developments, I couldn't help feeling anxious. "Shouldn't we be doing something more proactive?" I asked. "Filing a complaint against the HOA, maybe getting a restraining order against Victoria." Grandpa shook his head, a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "In litigation, patience is often the best strategy," he explained. "Right now, Victoria is making mistakes, creating a paper trail of harassment, making false statements in public, possibly filing fraudulent documents. The more rope we give her, the more thoroughly she'll entangle herself." He turned back to the document he'd been studying when I arrived. A detailed timeline he was constructing of every interaction with Victoria and the HOA. He added, "I've spent 40 years preparing for cases like this. She's spent, 4 or 5 years bullying retirees and young families who can't fight back? I like our odds." Just as Grandpa finished speaking, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Tom Wilson, our neighbor. Grandpa answered, his expression growing increasingly serious as he listened. When he hung up, he looked troubled for the first time since this ordeal began. "Tom says Victoria has called an emergency HOA board meeting for tonight. Closed session, board members only. Apparently she's presenting shocking new evidence about my property." He drummed his fingers on the desk thoughtfully. Tom couldn't get details, but he overheard something about grounds for immediate legal action. I felt a spike of worry, but Grandpa merely nodded as if Victoria's move confirmed some private theory he'd been developing. "It seems we're moving to the next phase sooner than I expected," he said, reaching for his legal pad. "We'll need to prepare for a court summons. If I know Victoria's type, she's not going to waste any time now." His prediction proved accurate. The next morning, a process server arrived at the lodge with papers summoning Grandpa to district court for a preliminary hearing. The HOA was seeking an emergency injunction to force compliance with their regulations, citing substantial evidence of fraudulent property claims and dangerous conditions creating public hazards. Grandpa read through the filing carefully, then set it aside with a strange expression, almost satisfaction. "And now the real game begins," he said, picking up his phone. As he began dialing, I caught a glimpse of the steely determination that must have made him such a formidable opponent in the courtroom. Whoever Victoria Harrington thought she was dealing with, she was about to discover her grievous miscalculation. The morning of the preliminary hearing arrived with a clarity that seemed symbolic. The mountain air crisp and transparent, the sky a perfect cloudless blue. Grandpa spent an hour in his study before emerging in a suit I hadn't seen him wear since his retirement party. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. Gone was the relaxed retiree in flannel shirts and reading glasses, replaced by James Reynolds, Esquire, whose name had once struck both respect and apprehension in courtrooms across the country. "Always dress for the battle you're fighting, not the one your opponent expects," he remarked, straightening his tie as we prepared to leave. In the car, he went over his strategy once more, reminding me that no matter what happened in court today, it was merely the opening gambit in what might become a protracted legal chess match. The Pine County Courthouse was a modest but dignified building in the center of town. As we climbed the steps, I noticed Victoria and her entourage already waiting in the lobby. She was accompanied by a sleek, expensive-looking attorney and several HOA board members, who kept shooting nervous glances at Grandpa. Victoria herself maintained a facade of confidence, though I caught the slight widening of her eyes when she saw Grandpa in his court attire, perhaps the first inkling that she might have underestimated her opponent. "Mr. Reynolds," she acknowledged stiffly as we passed. "I've tried to be reasonable, but you've left us no choice but to let the courts decide this matter." Grandpa merely nodded politely. "Indeed, Miss Harrington, I look forward to the court's perspective." The slight emphasis he placed on court carried a weight that seemed to momentarily unsettle her. Inside the courtroom, Victoria's attorney, a young man named Bradley Mitchell from a regional firm, presented their case first. He spoke with rehearsed precision, displaying maps, photos, and documents on a digital screen for the judge. "Your Honor, the evidence clearly shows that Mr. Reynolds' property falls within the legally established boundaries of the Pine Valley Homeowners Association," Mitchell argued. "Furthermore, his continued refusal to comply with safety and environmental regulations poses a clear and present danger to the community." He presented affidavits from concerned neighbors, whom I noticed were all HOA board members or their spouses, attesting to various hazards allegedly emanating from Grandpa's property. Mitchell concluded with what he clearly believed was his strongest argument, a document showing Grandpa's signature on the HOA incorporation agreement from 5 years ago. Throughout this presentation, Grandpa sat quietly beside me, occasionally making notes but otherwise showing no reaction. When it was his turn to respond, he approached the bench with a calm, measured pace that instantly commanded attention. "Your Honor, I appreciate the court's time today, and I'll be brief," he began. "The allegations against my property are not only baseless but represent part of a disturbing pattern of harassment and attempted property seizure by the current HOA leader." Without referring to notes, he systematically dismantled each of the HOA's claims. First, he presented the original property records showing his lodge predated the HOA by decades and was explicitly excluded from its jurisdiction in the founding documents. Next, he addressed the supposed safety violations, producing recent inspection certificates that had given the property a clean bill of health. The most dramatic moment came when Grandpa addressed the allegedly signed HOA agreement. "Your Honor, I was physically in Boston on the date this document was supposedly signed, as these travel records confirm," he said, submitting his evidence. "Furthermore, I've taken the liberty of having the signature analyzed by Patricia Chambers, a court-certified handwriting expert whose credentials are included in my filing. Ms. Chambers has provided a sworn statement that the signature on this document is a forgery, and not even a particularly skilled one." A murmur ran through the courtroom. Victoria's face had gone pale, and her attorney looked distinctly uncomfortable. Grandpa wasn't finished. "Additionally, I would draw the court's attention to these property acquisitions over the past 3 years," he continued, displaying a map with several properties highlighted. "Each of these homeowners was subjected to similar harassment and dubious legal claims before eventually selling to HOA-affiliated buyers at well below market value. I submit that this represents a pattern of predatory behavior designed to acquire properties for a planned commercial development." The judge, an older woman with sharp eyes and an attentive expression, had been watching both presentations carefully. Now she leaned forward. "Mr. Mitchell, did you personally verify the authenticity of the signature on the HOA agreement?" The attorney hesitated, clearly caught off guard. "I was assured by my clients that it was legitimate, Your Honor." The judge's expression hardened slightly. "And were you aware of the property acquisition pattern Mr. Reynolds has described?" Mitchell glanced at Victoria, who was now staring fixedly at the table in front of her. "I was not familiar with those specific details, Your Honor." The judge made a note before addressing both parties. "Based on the evidence presented, I'm denying the HOA's request for an emergency injunction. Furthermore, I'm ordering all HOA enforcement actions against Mr. Reynolds' property to cease immediately, pending a full hearing. And Mr. Mitchell," she fixed the young attorney with a stern look, "I strongly suggest you verify the authenticity of all documents before presenting them to my court in the future." As we left the courtroom, I could barely contain my elation at this initial victory. Victoria and her team huddled in urgent conversation, occasionally casting dark glances our way. When we reached the courthouse steps, Victoria broke away from her group and approached us, her composure visibly strained. "You may have won this round, but I have resources you can't imagine. By the time I'm done, you'll wish you'd just signed the agreement when I first asked." Grandpa regarded her calmly. Ms. Harrington, I would advise you to consider your next steps very carefully. Harassment, forgery, filing false claims. These are serious matters with potential criminal implications. Victoria's expression flickered between anger and something that might have been fear. "Are you threatening me?" she demanded. "Not at all," Grandpa replied. "I'm simply suggesting you consult with legal counsel who has your best interests in mind, rather than the HOA's. Good day, Ms. Harrington." As we walked away, I caught a glimpse of Victoria's face, the look of someone beginning to realize they might have made a terrible miscalculation. After our preliminary court victory, Victoria changed tactics. Though she maintained her distance, Tom Wilson reported she was spreading rumors about Grandpa, using the lodge for tax evasion or money laundering. "She's saying there must be something illegal going on for you to fight so hard to keep the property outside HOA oversight," Tom explained. Grandpa remained untroubled, though he prudently had me install additional security cameras around our property perimeter. This precaution proved wise when our motion sensors captured footage of 2 men trespassing near our stream at night, carrying suspicious containers. After alerting the sheriff, Grandpa and I discovered several containers of motor oil and industrial waste deliberately planted near our water source. "They're setting up evidence of environmental contamination," Grandpa explained grimly as we documented and removed the containers. "If the HOA could prove I was polluting the watershed, they'd have grounds for immediate intervention." The next morning, county EPA inspectors arrived, responding to an anonymous tip about hazardous waste dumping. When Grandpa showed them our security footage of the previous night's sabotage, their attitudes shifted immediately. "Filing false environmental reports is a serious offense," the lead inspector noted, promising their report would reflect the attempted setup rather than any actual violations. Our ally Sarah Donovan from the county records office soon arrived with concerning news. Victoria's attorneys had been requesting every document related to our property's history. "They're looking for any technical flaw in the property's history," Grandpa explained later. "A missed filing, an expired permit, anything they could use to challenge the property's legal standing." When our cameras captured Victoria herself inspecting the edge of our property with a county official, Grandpa smiled knowingly. "I think Miss Harrington just made her first serious tactical error," he said, spending the afternoon preparing documents. His plan was decisive. "Tomorrow we're filing our own lawsuit against Miss Harrington and the HOA for harassment, attempted property damage, and fraudulent legal claims." Victoria's desperation had driven her to actions that would now become powerful evidence against her. The Pine County Courthouse was significantly more crowded for our hearing than it had been for the preliminary injunction. News of the conflict between Grandpa and the HOA had spread through the community, drawing curious neighbors, local reporters, and even a few law students who recognized James Reynolds' name from their textbooks. Victoria arrived with an expanded legal team, not just Bradley Mitchell this time, but a senior partner from his firm as well. They huddled in urgent conversation right up until the bailiff called the court to order. Grandpa, meanwhile, sat beside me in perfect composure, reviewing his notes one final time before tucking them neatly into his briefcase. Judge Eleanor Simmons, who had presided over our previous hearing, entered the courtroom with a no-nonsense expression. After the formalities, she addressed both parties directly. "I've reviewed the filings from both sides, and I must say I'm troubled by the escalation of this dispute. Mr. Reynolds has filed serious countercharges against Miss Harrington and the Pine Valley HOA, including harassment, attempted property damage, and filing fraudulent documents with the court. The HOA, meanwhile, continues to press its claim that Mr. Reynolds' property falls under their jurisdiction, and contends that his accusations are merely delay tactics to avoid compliance." She fixed both parties with a stern look. "I expect this hearing to proceed with civility and respect for the court's time. Is that clear?" Both sides nodded their agreement. Victoria's attorneys presented their case first, adopting a more aggressive strategy than before. The senior partner, Edward Blackwell, was a polished speaker who clearly knew how to present even flimsy evidence with an air of gravity. "Your Honor, while Mr. Reynolds may have an impressive legal background, he appears to have forgotten some fundamental principles of property law," Blackwell began. his tone both patronizing and confident. The fact is, his property exists within a community that has collectively agreed to certain standards. His refusal to acknowledge this reality doesn't change it. Their presentation included drone footage showing the lodge in relation to other HOA properties, testimonials from board members about the disruptive impact of Grandpa's non-compliance, and complex legal arguments about implied consent through historical use of HOA-maintained roads and utilities. I felt a flicker of anxiety as Blackwell presented what seemed like an overwhelming amount of documentation. He skillfully wove together half-truths and misleading correlations to create the impression that Grandpa was an obstinate troublemaker undermining community harmony. Their most aggressive tactic came when Blackwell directly questioned Grandpa's mental acuity. "We must consider whether Mr. Reynolds, given his advanced age and isolation, is fully capable of understanding the implications of his actions," he suggested with feigned concern. "Perhaps his resistance stems not from legal conviction, but from confusion about modern community governance." I felt Grandpa tense slightly beside me at this thinly veiled insult, but his expression remained impassive. When it was Grandpa's turn, he approached the podium with deliberate calmness. "Your Honor, I want to thank Mr. Blackwell for his concern about my mental faculties," he began, a hint of dry humor in his voice. "I assure the court that my understanding of property law remains intact, as does my ability to recognize a coordinated attempt at property seizure when I see one." What followed was a masterclass in methodical legal dismantling. Rather than matching the HOA's voluminous paperwork with his own, Grandpa focused on a few key documents that exposed the fundamental weaknesses in their case. He presented the original township survey showing the clear boundaries that excluded his property, followed by county records that had never been amended to incorporate the lodge into the HOA territory. Most devastating was the evidence Grandpa had gathered of Victoria's pattern of harassment. "Your Honor, this isn't just about boundary disputes or community standards," he explained. "This is about systematic intimidation for financial gain." He presented the security footage showing the trespassers planting contaminants near our stream, along with the EPA inspector's subsequent report confirming the attempted setup. He showed financial records tracing a pattern of property acquisitions following similar harassment campaigns. Perhaps most damaging was testimony from former residents who had been driven out by Victoria's tactics, their statements taken under oath and submitted as affidavits. With each piece of evidence, Victoria's face grew paler, and her attorneys exchanged increasingly worried glances. The turning point came when Grandpa addressed the forged signature directly. "Your Honor, document falsification is a serious matter in any context, but especially when used to deprive someone of their property rights," he said, his voice taking on added gravity. "I've submitted expert analysis confirming that the signature on the HOA agreement is not mine. I've also provided evidence that I was physically in another state on the date this document was supposedly signed." He paused, allowing the implications to sink in. "I believe this raises serious questions not only about the HOA's claims against my property, but about the legality of their actions regarding other properties as well." Judge Simmons, who had been taking notes throughout both presentations, now turned her attention to Victoria directly. "Ms. Harrington, these are extremely serious allegations. Do you have any explanation for the discrepancies Mr. Reynolds has identified?" Victoria, clearly unprepared to be addressed personally, looked to her attorneys for help. Blackwell rose quickly. "Your Honor, my client acted in good faith based on documentation provided to her when she assumed her position with the HOA. If there are irregularities, they predate her involvement." It was a weak defense, and everyone in the courtroom knew it. The judge's skeptical expression said as much. "That's strange, Mr. Blackwell, considering that the allegedly forged document bears a date that falls squarely within Ms. Harrington's tenure as HOA vice president." The rest of the hearing unfolded like a slow-motion collapse of Victoria's carefully constructed facade. Her witnesses contradicted each other under Grandpa's measured cross-examination. The technical legal arguments that had sounded so impressive in Blackwell's presentation fell apart when Grandpa pointed out their reliance on misapplied precedents. By the time closing arguments arrived, The mood in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Victoria sat rigid with tension, occasionally whispering urgently to her attorneys, who seemed increasingly resigned to defeat. Grandpa, in contrast, delivered his final statement with the quiet confidence of someone who knows the truth is firmly on his side. Your Honor, this case has never really been about community standards or property boundaries, he concluded. It's about the abuse of organizational power for personal gain and the right of property owners to be secure in their lawfully acquired homes. I ask the court not only to affirm that my property remains outside HOA jurisdiction, but to consider appropriate sanctions for the pattern of harassment and fraud that has been demonstrated here today. As he returned to his seat, I noticed several spectators nodding in agreement, and even a few offering silent applause. Judge Simmons announced she would review all evidence and issue her ruling within a week, but her expression as she looked at Victoria suggested that ruling was unlikely to favor the HOA. As we exited the courtroom, Victoria pushed past her attorneys to confront Grandpa. Her carefully maintained composure had finally cracked, revealing the raw anger beneath. "You think you've won, but this isn't over," she hissed, keeping her voice low but intense. "I have connections you can't imagine. By the time I'm done with you—" Grandpa cut her off with a calm, raised hand. "Ms. Harrington, I would strongly advise against making statements that could be construed as threats, especially in a courthouse filled with witnesses. Your position is precarious enough already." Victoria's eyes darted around, suddenly aware of the attention her confrontation was drawing. Without another word, she turned and stormed away, her high heels clicking sharply on the marble floor as her legal team hurried to keep up. As we drove home, I finally asked the question that had been nagging at me throughout the hearing. "Do you think she'll really face consequences for what she's done? People like Victoria seem to always land on their feet somehow." Grandpa was quiet for a moment, watching the mountain scenery roll past. "Justice isn't always perfect," he finally said, "but in my experience, when you expose corruption decisively enough, it becomes very difficult for the community to continue enabling it." Victoria's power came from perception. Once that's shattered, her leverage disappears. He smiled slightly. "Besides, I don't think the county prosecutor is going to ignore evidence of document forgery and environmental tampering. Some battles continue long after the courtroom doors close." Judge Simmons didn't wait a week to issue her ruling. 3 days after the hearing, her decision arrived by courier. Not only was Grandpa's property definitively declared outside HOA jurisdiction, but the judge had referred the case to the district attorney's office for investigation of possible criminal charges related to document falsification and environmental crimes. Additionally, Victoria and the HOA were ordered to pay Grandpa's legal costs and a substantial sum in punitive damages for harassment. The decision sent shockwaves through Pine Valley. Robert Johnson, the HOA president, hastily called an emergency meeting where Victoria was suspended from her position pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. Former board members who had supported her began distancing themselves, claiming they had been misled about the legal basis for her action. For Victoria, the collapse was swift and comprehensive. The law firm that had represented her withdrew their services, citing irreconcilable differences regarding case strategy. Neighbors who had once deferred to her authority now openly discussed her tactics, sharing stories that had previously been whispered behind closed doors. Most damaging was the interest from local media, who began investigating the pattern of property acquisitions following HOA harassment. A front-page article in the Pine County Gazette questioned whether Victoria's actions were part of a larger real estate speculation scheme, noting that several properties forced out of private ownership had subsequently been sold to a development company with ties to Victoria's brother-in-law. Within weeks, Victoria's carefully constructed world had unraveled completely. The financial penalties from the lawsuit, combined with mounting legal fees for her criminal defense and the loss of her commission income from planned property sales, left her in dire financial straits. Tom Wilson, always our most reliable source of community gossip, reported that she had listed her own house for sale and was attempting to liquidate assets before the criminal proceedings could result in additional penalties. Word is she might lose her real estate license too, he added during one of his frequent visits to the lodge. The state licensing board doesn't look kindly on fraud allegations, especially when they're this well documented. I expected to find Grandpa satisfied with this outcome, perhaps even triumphant. Victoria had, after all, attempted to steal his beloved mountain home through intimidation and fraud. But as we sat on the porch watching the sunset one evening, I noticed a thoughtful, almost troubled expression on his face. "Something bothering you?" I asked. He was quiet for a long moment before responding. "In 40 years of practicing law, I've seen what legal battles do to people," he finally said. "Even when you win, there's a cost. Victoria did wrong, serious wrong, and she needs to face consequences. But watching someone lose everything, it's never as satisfying as you might imagine." The next morning, Grandpa made a series of phone calls from his study, speaking too quietly for me to hear the conversations. When he emerged, he announced that he needed to go into town and asked if I would drive him. Our destination, to my surprise, was a small cafe near the courthouse where Victoria was waiting at a corner table. She looked markedly different from the confident, imperious woman who had first appeared on our doorstep. Her designer clothes replaced by simpler attire, the perfect makeup subdued, dark circles visible beneath her eyes. She tensed visibly when she saw us approaching, her expression a complex mixture of defiance, resignation, and something that might have been fear. "Thank you for agreeing to meet, Miss Harrington," Grandpa said formally as he settled into the chair across from her. I took a seat slightly apart, close enough to hear, but giving them some space for their conversation. Victoria regarded him warily. "Your message said you wanted to discuss options," she replied, her voice lacking its former certainty. "I'm not sure what options I have left, thanks to you." There was bitterness in her tone, but it seemed reflexive rather than heartfelt. The words of someone still trying to maintain the fiction that she was the wronged party. Grandpa didn't react to the implied accusation. Instead, he placed a folder on the table between them. "I've spoken with the district attorney this morning," he said calmly. "While the criminal investigation will proceed, there may be room for a plea arrangement that avoids the most severe penalties. Similarly, while I can't withdraw the civil judgment entirely, I can work with my attorney to structure a payment plan that doesn't require immediate liquidation of all your assets." Victoria stared at him, suspicion evident in her expression. "Why would you do that? You won." Grandpa considered his response carefully. "Justice isn't about destruction, Ms. Harrington. It's about correction. You did wrong, and there are consequences for that, but those consequences don't need to be unnecessarily destructive." He opened the folder, revealing a document he'd prepared. "This agreement stipulates that you will resign permanently from the HOA, cease all attempts to incorporate my property or others on the ridge into HOA territory, and cooperate fully with authorities investigating any fraudulent property transfers. In exchange, I'll advocate for leniency in both the criminal and civil penalties." Victoria's eyes widened as she scanned the document. "This is not what I expected," she admitted, her voice losing some of its defensive edge. "Most people would want to see me ruined after what happened." Grandpa nodded. "Perhaps, but adding another ruined life to the world doesn't make it a better place. The point is to stop the harm you were causing, not to cause equal harm in return." Victoria was silent for a long moment, her eyes fixed on the document. When she finally looked up, something had shifted in her expression. Not gratitude exactly, there was still too much pride for that, but perhaps the first glimmer of genuine reflection. "I never thought of it as harm," she said quietly. "It was just business, opportunities. Everyone does it." Grandpa shook his head. "Not everyone, Miss Harrington. And calling something business doesn't make it right." He pushed the document closer to her. "You have a choice now. You can fight to the bitter end and potentially lose everything, or you can accept responsibility, make what amends you can, and eventually rebuild your life, hopefully with better principles." After another long moment, Victoria reached for the pen Grandpa offered. Her hand trembled slightly as she signed the agreement. "I "Don't understand you," she said as she slid the document back across the table. "In your position, I would have shown no mercy." Grandpa's response was gentle but firm. "That difference in perspective is precisely why we're sitting on opposite sides of this table, Miss Harrington." As we stood to leave, Victoria remained seated, staring into her untouched coffee with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps the first honest self-reflection she'd engaged in for a very long time. 6 months later, as autumn painted the mountains in vibrant colors, the aftermath of our legal battle had settled into resolution. Victoria had pleaded guilty to reduced charges, receiving probation and community service rather than jail time. Though still facing substantial civil penalties, the payment plan Grandpa had negotiated allowed her to meet obligations without complete financial ruin. Her real estate license was suspended and she eventually left Pine Valley, while the development scheme she had orchestrated collapsed once its predatory tactics were exposed. The HOA underwent remarkable transformation after Victoria's departure. Under new leadership that included our neighbor Tom Wilson, they adopted a more service-oriented approach, formally recognizing boundary lines that respected historical property rights like Grandpa's, and implementing reforms for transparency and resident protection. The community organized a gathering at our lodge one October afternoon, a celebration that honored not just Grandpa's victory but the neighborhood's renewal. As Tom Wilson raised a toast to Grandpa, praising him for standing against power abuse with integrity, I realized how this ordeal had strengthened rather than fractured the community. Later that evening, Grandpa reflected on the porch. Sometimes the most important legal victories happen outside the courtroom. Victoria lost her power not just because of court rulings, but because once people saw the truth, they refused to continue enabling her behavior. Communities have inherent wisdom if given the chance to exercise it. The experience inspired Grandpa to develop a legal resource center for community members facing similar situations. Transforming the mountain lodge Victoria had tried to seize into a hub for helping others protect their rights. For me, the ordeal taught an unexpected lesson about standing firm against intimidation, even when surrender seems easier. Had we given in to Victoria's demands, we might have avoided months of stress, but we would have lost something far more valuable than property: the conviction that justice, while imperfect and sometimes arduous, remains worth fighting for. So if you're facing your own HOA Karen or any form of unjust power, remember this story. Document everything, know your rights, find allies, and never underestimate the power of principled resistance. Sometimes bullies pick fights with exactly the wrong person, and in that miscalculation lies the potential for not just personal vindication, but community transformation. If you enjoyed this tale of justice served, like and subscribe for more stories that remind us that sometimes the good guys do win, especially when they come prepared with all the legal cards in hand.